Upgrading fire sprinklers in condo buildings. Peter and Chief?
Good morning, I'm Diana Matty. I'm the fire chief for West Palm. I'd like to introduce Chief Peter LeDuc. He's our fire marshal. He'll be talking to you about the sprinkler ordinance.
Good morning.
Good morning, Pete.
It's a pleasure to be before you. Give me a second
Tell
here.
us everything we need to know about sprinklers.
Yes. We'll talk about fire sprinklers, but most importantly, the hot subject is the high-rise retrofit issue. That's just a picture of one of the high-rises here. I'd like to start with a brief history. Other than where we're at, we got to know where we came from. Tragic loss of life due to high-rise properties. The MGM Grand in 1980 in Las Vegas, 87 deaths in the DuPont Plaza Hotel fire in 86 with 97 deaths led to the national study, which says that they're not going to stay in any place, any high-rise that doesn't have fire sprinklers, basically. And these tragic fires, the fire code is written mostly due to tragic events. It's how do we address these issues and prevent them from happening in the future.
Will you pull that mic up closer to you?
What we have to understand is, in a fire situation, the sprinkler is designed not to necessarily put the fire out. It's designed to hold it in place. What happens is, in these hotel fires that occurred in the past, is the smoke, when it's heated, it travels upward. And it looks for anything else, any way to travel upward, and it gets into stairwells and it gets into elevator shafts, and it just goes up. And as it goes up, it starts to cool down. As it cools down, it spreads out. And so what was happening in these fires is these people were on the upper floors, these fires were on the lower floors, and as the smoke went up, they got into the stairwells. What happens is the fire will knock you down. The smoke will knock you down. It's not the fire that will kill you, it's the toxins in the smoke that'll knock you out, make you unconscious, and then you'll die there from lack of oxygen. And that's basically what happened in those hills. They found them in the elevators on the upper floors. You start to go down and you can only make it a certain mile, and you start spinning and then you crash, and that's where they find you in the end. And so the life safety code addresses situations like this, and how can that be prevented in the future. And in 1991 they provided the existing high rises, which is over 75 foot tall is the definition of a high rise. Down from the level of discharge, need to be retrofitted with fire sprinkler systems. And the requirement was adopted in the Florida Fire Prevention Code in the year 2000. So this retrofit issue isn't a new issue. It's an issue that has been around for over 18 years. It has just been kind of kicked down the road a little bit because it's political. It's difficult for these high-rises to get retrofitted, so it's expensive and the costs are incurred, but people have fixed incomes and can get quite expensive. But the original compliance deadline was 2012, but they extended that into the future due to the legislative session, and because they had to give people time to afford it. But there was never any mandate for anything less than a high-rise. It was always high-rise or higher. But there was some confusion in the latest legislative session about lower condominiums and those kind of things because of some wording in some other statute language that really wasn't relevant. And that was Chapter 718 there in the bottom. To retrofit fire sprinklers or the ability to opt out for the membership of the condominiums, the residents to opt out. That means that they wouldn't have to put sprinklers on it, that they would take a vote to either put the sprinklers in or not put them in, and they have a choice. And most, I don't think there's anyone that has voted to put sprinklers in. They've pretty much all opted out. But the language was such that once you opted out of that, you opted into something else, and that was called an ELSS. And we'll look at that language in the future. But that change occurred in 2010, so it gave them a 6-year window, 2016, in order to comply with that. So this would be the current law. And here is the ELSS language, which stands for Engineered Life Safety System. And it gave the deadline to do this in 2016. And once they did the vote, then they had till 2019 to actually complete the project. Well, what happened during the legislative session is that they extended it. And they extended it into the 2019 compliance date of December 31st, which is upcoming. So the local authority having jurisdiction, which is the fire department, Chief Matty and myself, we can't require them to do anything faster than that. We can only require them to do what the legislative language says. So then they would have to have a building permit for the actual ELS work or the fire sprinkler system as well. And demonstrating their vote, demonstrating that they have the permit and they have the ELSS. So once they voted, they had the option of doing the ELSS, and that what is a licensed life safety engineer would come in, evaluate their building, present a document. I would review the document and determine if it meets my standards for fire safety and meeting the language of the code. Basically, in there it says that it include sprinklers in the common areas, which would be your hallways, your rooms like this would be a common area, whatever you would gather, as well as smoke removal systems, pressurized stairwells or pressurized elevators would be some of these things that would be considered to be equivalent to fire sprinklers, or at least having the ability. Having these ELSSs gives time for people to get out. So if you have a you don't have a sprinkler, but there's a fire in a unit, you can escape the unit because they have a fire alarm in there. So you escape the unit, you go out into your corridor, which would typically be an open corridor, it can be an enclosed corridor, and then you would get to the stairwell. The stairwell will be pressurized, which means that if the door got left open, the pressure inside the stairwell is going to keep the smoke out and you can get down. It gives people time to escape. And a pressurized elevator, if there's smoke below, as the elevator would come up, or if the elevator recalled to the bottom floor as it should, if it gets through the cracks of the doors, the smoke wouldn't go up. The pressurized stairwell keeps the smoke back. So it doesn't extend beyond the area of origin. And that's the whole point. There's two aspects of fire in your apartment, is the effect of the person in the apartment and then the effect of the people outside the apartment. So you want to be sure that the people inside the apartment can wake up and get out, and the people outside the apartment also know it's not their fire, but they know that there's a fire in the building and they give them the opportunity to escape. And that is what the basis of the ELS system would be. Section 633 of the Florida statute gives the state fire marshal to adopt the Florida Fire Prevention Code. We are in a cycle, a 3-year cycle. Every 3 years, the Florida Fire Prevention Code gets readopted, and it adopts a certain edition of the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association Code. We're typically about 3 years behind. We're in the 2015 code now. It'll get readopted in December 19, and it'll be 3 more years. We'll be in 2018 code. Though there may be, right now there's a 2018 code, but it's not adopted by the state of Florida, so we can't enforce it. We enforce 2015. And the Florida Administrative Code says that we're going to use a standard of NFPA. So here's the actual code in the Florida Fire Prevention Code. It's Chapter 31, which is existing high-rise buildings. The underline and highlight is the most important part.
Is there a specific definition of high-rise?
There is. A high-rise building is 75 foot or higher.
Okay.
From the point of fire department access, and that is the other part of it. So where does the fire department park their truck? Sometimes high-rises are built on a grade, and if we can't get our truck up there...
Sure. So it's 75 from that.
From that point.
Uh-huh.
And that's the definition point of the high-rise.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So the bottom part there with the numbers 1 through 5 in the bottom, those are the things that you can have any or all of the following systems. You can have a partial automatic fire sprinkler system, a smoke detection system, smoke control, compartmentalization, or another approved system. And the ELS engineer would evaluate each building and see how any of this stuff plugs in. Most of them have fire alarm systems. Some are older. Some have some smoke detection system, maybe not complete. Some have some smoke control and some none. And compartmentalization, which is rare. And that is basically closing of doors and having smoke barriers, those kind of things. So that's the actual code that we've been applying. So during the previous legislative session, the bill was proposed to change the language that was adopted in 2010. Okay, so this was part of that. And it was a House Bill 653, which required the condominiums for high-rises to be marked with a symbol from the State Fire Marshal's office that didn't have a sprinkler system. You'd actually get a sign that says, this building does not have a fire sprinkler system. And this was the language that was proposed. There was no obligation to retrofit the fire sprinkler system or anything like that from the previous definition if there was a 2/3 vote of the affirmative. So that means 2/3 of the residents would have to vote, officially vote, and say, we know we don't have fire sprinkler systems, and we're going to put something on our building that everyone can see when they approach it that says, you know, this is, they never worked out the language, but this was the intent, is to have a sign that says this is not fire sprinkler. However, on June 26th, the governor vetoed that House bill, which in essence didn't change anything. The law still was in effect. There was a lot of condominium associations who were waiting on their ELSS because they knew this kind of language was coming down. But this was part of the reason the governor did that. I think you understand is the fire in England, and then there was another fire after that, I think in Hawaii, where, you know, there was loss of life and significant damage and, you know, some issues. So, like I said, basically that means that nothing changed. And there was a lot of communication with the condominiums, or high-rises, excuse me. I don't like to use condominiums because that's a little different. We'll say high-rises that were affected. Like, so what does that mean? Well, it means nothing. You've had till 2010 to prepare for this. You've been stalling because of these kind of things. And so now here we are. We can't stall anymore. And now you have to provide these ELSSs. So what does West Palm have? And this is where we get into the nuts and bolts. These are the condominiums that do not have sprinkler systems and do not have any kind of compartmentalization or those 5 things that I listed before, but two do have stairwell separation, and they do have the ability to have smoke control in their stairwells. So those 2 in the bottom, in essence, can actually vote to opt out and then pretty much not do anything because they have pretty much everything else that can be done. So all these other ones have been notified multiple times over the past several years to comply with their ELSSs. And they've been really responsive. We've met with a few of them. We've also met Palm Beach County-wide with a lot of other jurisdictions and gave information out. And basically this is where we're at. 3 of the condominiums have provided ELS documents that I have approved. What they do is they offer a partial sprinkler system. The common areas are sprinkled, stairwell pressurization, elevator pressurization, and also a sprinkler head at the door inside the unit. Not each individual rooms inside the unit where you would see a complete sprinkler system, but just one at the door. The one at the door, the intent is like I said, those who are intimate with the fire is to keep that fire in check. If those people exited out their door and for some reason the door didn't close, the fire is going to look for oxygen, so it's going to race towards the door. The sprinkler head will go off and then basically hold that fire from exiting out that unit, which would then affect the rest of the building. That is the intent of what I accepted. Because of the potential cost and the ability to protect those getting out, they're upgrading their sprinkler, their fire alarm systems, and their smoke control systems, so you get early activation of the fire, early notification, so you're able to get out, you exit out, and as you go down the hallway, you know you're going to be protected with the sprinklers in your hall. And once you get to the stairwell, you know you're going to be protected in that stairwell. Two of the high-rises submitted ELS documentation, although I have not accepted them yet. We're still in negotiations. They don't want to do the sprinkler at the door. I want to keep a consistent acceptance of my ELSSs. Some are claiming compartmentalization. I'm not completely sold on their idea of what that means, of the intent of it, but it's a positive discussion, and we're probably, going to end up in the same place. It's just a matter of time. The statement at the bottom is, though we've accepted them, no one's done the permitting yet. So we still haven't seen the permitting yet, but they still have a year and a half to get it done. There's still some challenges with the ELSs. Even though they're opting out of that and they're opting into a stairwell pressurization, there's no guarantee that the pressurization is going to work. It is a very difficult thing to repair all the doors, fix all the leaks in the stairwells, then turn the system on and actually work. Because the doors have to open with a certain pressure, they have to close and seal. There's some challenges with that. And they've all been discussed that you may not be able to get your pressurization. We could work for years in getting, we've had a building here in the city, it's a newer building that can't get the stairwell pressurized correctly. And so that cost is, they think it's cheaper than a sprinkler, but there's no really any estimates that have really come hard on these people. Everyone's estimating. They're saying upwards to $800 to $1,300 to $2,000 a unit to do a sprinkler system. But no one's really done the same thing for a stair pressurization system, because a lot of times all the doors have to be replaced. Because the existing doors just aren't going to seal properly. So there's a large cost of that. Then we put the motor, and so those kind of things happening. So,
Chief, we have a question. Commissioner.
Thank you. Quick question, Chief. So you mentioned that you've not accepted a couple of the high-rises proposals around how to mitigate this. Have they hired experts? I mean, you're the expert on this. Are there other experts that you're talking to in coordination with this, or just the owners of the units? Not that they couldn't be experts, but...
Thank you for the compliment. I don't consider myself an expert.
More so than me on fire. So.
Thank you. But they hire Florida registered engineers. That's one of the requirements. They can't just be somebody who was once an engineer back in the past and now lives in the condominium and he says it's safe, because we get a lot of that. They have to be a Florida registered engineer, professional engineer with a signed, sealed, and stamped. All of these ELSSs have to be signed and sealed and stamped, and they have to then have to be designed per their expertise, the experts. I just review those things for compliance with the code.
Gotcha.
I consider myself somewhat of a code expert, but certainly not an expert where I'm going to design a smoke control system or any of these other ones. That's where I rely upon their expertise. And that's one of the things that a lot of times when they design these systems, the engineer will stamp it, but then never again visit the building to make sure that it works right. And that's one of the things that I require, is this engineer has to review the system, test it before I even go in and test it.
So is it correct to say that the building either has to have a sprinkler system or this ELSS system?
That's the basics to it.
Can
Yes,
they
ma'am.
decide to retrofit a sprinkler system in it?
They absolutely can.
They can choose to do that
They can
still.
choose. Yeah, absolutely. And I've told each one of
And
them.
if they don't choose to do that, they have to have an alternative by December of 2019.
Correct.
That's the bottom line.
That's the bottom line.
All right, good.
And I've also allowed them to, if they don't get this done and they can't get their pressurization, I'll allow them to amend and then put in a full sprinkler system, because I want a full sprinkler system. I don't want this ELS
That's better.
system.
Yeah.
Correct. Correct.
Commissioner Ryan, did you have a question?
I was going to let you finish, but where I want to get to is how many buildings in the city have not responded, and you said you've got ELS systems, but no permits are pulled. So I guess everybody's going through the construction cost. So I was just kind of curious as to what that process is going to be, because this is a product of phone calls I've received from condominiums in my district along the South Flagler, wanting to know what to do and what they're well, not what to do, but what they're looking at from an assessment, because the residents are ultimately going to be a special assessed.
That's up to them to figure that out.
And that's the thing. There has
I mean,
been
they
no...
have to decide what they're going to do and how much it's going to cost.
Right, and some of the residents don't know all of this that we're hearing today, because there's confusion, as you mentioned, with the governor vetoing the bill. That everybody was kind of moving towards this direction that maybe we wouldn't have to comply. So anyway, it's a communication, trying to get everybody the right.
I understand, and we've really, reached out to all the management at each of these buildings that were affected to discuss these issues, and I thought we've done a good job on that. Some of the residents I can't talk about, but there have been no hard costs developed by any of these, any that I know, even in in the state of Florida almost. There's just no information out there for the really hard cost. A lot of these buildings have fire pumps. A lot of them have standpipes, and standpipes go up the stairwell with a fire department connection on them that have water in them. But each one of them different. They have their own personality, so those costs will be variable. So there isn't really any hard costs, not just for the retrofit of the sprinkler, or even the stair pressurization or elevator pressurization. There's just been no hard cost. And so, yeah, there's no information on the assessment of what these people are looking for because no one's willing to give it. I've talked to people in the industry and they don't want to because they don't want to get burned by the time when they actually get into the building. No one's really told them and they don't want to waste their time. No condo really said, hey, we want a hard price, and they're afraid to give it because they think that another high-rise is going to be the same, and it's just not. And so there's been a lot of that back and forth. So what are the next steps? All the buildings have been notified. We'll notify them again. I have another, I think it's our 4th letter, addressing those ones that haven't provided that.
So you've already sent 3 letters.
Correct. And we've had meetings and discussed it with people. But the ones that have really been proactive are the ones that have provided the ELSSs. The other ones are just kind of stalling. And at the end, there's a little bullet point. We'll continue to monitor each building for their ELS documents. We'll continue to monitor for their permitting because no permits have been applied for yet. Each of these high-rises still have to have their annual inspections. We'll continue to cite them for the deficiencies, and this ELSS would be another deficiency that they'll be cited for. But we'll continue to monitor the legislative session because there's already talk about now of changing the language or allowing them to opt out again. There's just still a lot out there, and I know there's a large push from some associations down south that are going to change the language. The Fire Chiefs Association of Florida, along with the fire marshals, are right now working with those legislative constituents, I guess you would say, to help soften the blow and try to do workarounds with some of this language. But it may very well go again that they're going to opt out and 2/3 vote. I've heard that they'll get to say no, and I won't have to have. They won't need to do an ELS. So some of those questions have been coming now. Well, we've already haven't approved ELS. So what if the legislative language changes? Well, it's a law, and I enforce that, and there's nothing I can do about it. You just have to provide a letter saying you're going to rescind that ELSS it, and I would accept it, and and we'll continue to do your annual inspections and make sure that whatever systems you do have in place work. There's really not much else we can do about that. We have a great fire department. They're very aggressive. Our inspections are going extremely well. I'm confident in our inspections and our fire department that if there was an issue, that it would be limited. Because they're experts. Our fire department is one of the best, I would say, in the county, not the best.
In the state? What do you mean the county?
Well, I haven't been everywhere. But that's it, and that's my presentation, and I'll field
Thank
any
you.
questions or anything else.
Yeah, we have a couple other questions. Commissioner
Great.
James, I saw your hand up over
Yeah,
there.
thank you. 2 questions. One is, I assume this applies to office buildings as well, high-rise office buildings?
No, apartment. Chapter 31 of the provider is just existing apartment buildings, not office buildings.
So what are the rules for office buildings?
It's a different section of the code, but if it's a high-rise, there's no residential living in there, and that's the thing where people sleep. They still have to have fire sprinkler systems and smoke control systems and those kind of things as a high-rise, but it's a little bit different because no one sleeps there.
Okay. And then secondly, what is the penalty for noncompliance?
That's the question we get a lot.
Yes.
The penalty is we could levy fines. We have that authority. We can also take them to the magistrate to make them comply. If they don't have their permitting, if they don't provide the information that they're supposed to comply with the law, like the voting and those kind of things, then they could go before the magistrate, and then the magistrate would levy daily fines or whatever the magistrate would seem fit. Try to avoid that at all costs. And the Ben's, compliance is moving slowly, but they're waiting for this next session, and there'll probably be a big push, and I think that's what they're stalling for. But we'll continue to cite them for the deficiencies, and we can cite them for reinspection fees if they don't do those kind of things. We've just been taking a softer line for it because there has been so much movement at the legislative session. if we get to that point, we'll sit down and have a meeting and try to decide the best course of action to take for compliance.
Commissioner Shove?
Thank you. One question, I think, for you, and maybe one for city at large. If you choose to implement the ELSS, is there an escalated inspection that goes on? Because I can install my fan at the top of the stairwell and my door seals, but those things get a lot more wear and tear than a sprinkler system would. So does that escalate that process?
It does, but it's more through a permitting. They would have to submit for building permitting, so they have a design set of plans. Everyone will review it in the city, including the mechanical, which is a part of the stair pressurization is mechanical code. So everyone will review it. Once those pass, then they would be inspections, and then compliance that actually works until you get a final inspection that everyone would sign off on, not just fire. It'd be building, mechanical, electrical, everyone else involved in that process.
Okay, and that kind of leads into my next question. I don't know if we've looked at, as we're looking at some of our infrastructure upgrades, to make sure that our plumbing lines can handle the pressure that these new fire suppression systems would have to have.
That's one of those things that is an unknown until you get into the building, and part of what they would have to evaluate is the interior condition of these existing piping, because they're old. I mean, some of these places were built in the early 70s, late 60s, and so some of that stuff is pretty corroded, and it may not be able to handle the pressures, and that's part of the unknown once you get into it, and the scary part of how expensive it could be once they start. Because you can assume it, and part of it is, but then when you get into it and you actually pump it up and you blow something out, it could happen. It's a very real possibility, and that just escalates the cost even more.
Yeah, I didn't know if that was something we could look into as we do our projects.
Yeah, as we move along this, absolutely, we're going to have to assess that. Thank you. Commissioner Lambert?
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I had a similar question about the penalty, and I started thinking about that even when you were asking the question, because really the penalty is what happens to our residents if there is a
Gonna
fire
die.
in there.
Absolutely.
That's the biggest penalty, right? A
Right.
tragedy. And so it doesn't seem excessive to me to request these parameters, but this isn't an excessive request. This is a pretty basic request to keep everybody safe in the event of a fire.
Oh, very, very clearly. But when you're in that unit that hadn't had an issue, for the 30 years you've been in there, now you're going to make me pay $2,000 or, whatever it is that I don't have because I'm on fixed income from the 60s. That's the hardest pill to do. And I agree with you. And I've been trying to educate based on what I know about it, is that sprinkler system would be cheaper than doing the pressurized stairwell.
Sounds like it would be simpler, too.
In most cases, it can be.
I don't know anything about any of this, but just to my thinking, put sprinklers in and get
Correct.
it over with.
But until you get the hard costs and someone's willing to communicate those costs, and once we stop this legislative back and forth ping-ponging, and that's what I think everyone. I mean, there's a lot of lawyers involved, and we've had so many communications with lawyers on this as well. Until that stops, which I thought we had here, but apparently it's back on again.
I'm curious, could we negotiate or help bring a contract to these buildings that say, hey, a larger buying capacity, we'll negotiate for 10 instead of them doing it one-off? And
well,
That's something to look at, I suppose.
part of that issue is I may be accepting something on the ELSS, but somebody in Miami-Dade or even up in Tallahassee or Gainesville may be accepting something else. So it's kind of tough to package something. Like these ELSSs that have been done are from the same company. And this is the company that seems to be the one that is getting most of the approvals, but I know that some of the things being accepted down south aren't the same things that I'm accepting here. The state doesn't give guidance on how to accept it. It's given to the authority having jurisdiction on an individual basis. So even the county may accept something different than what I'm accepting. We've tried to be all on the same page, but when you get into that negotiation with that company or with that condo association,
They have different needs.
they could accept something less, and so it's hard to make a package deal. And I think that some of the language that the fire chiefs and fire marshals are working at the state are addressing some of that issue. And I think they're looking for tax breaks and other things. And similar to what you're discussing, I don't know exactly because it's being done up there in those offices, but some of that language is being discussed. And as soon as the legislation starts, we can see what some of that fruit comes to.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ryan?
Thank you. One of the things that strikes me is that the issue is also our first responders. They're the ones that go in and try to, address life safety internally after a tragedy. So having these protections are not just for the residents, but it's also for our first responders. With that, because all of the conversations that I've had from my residents in District 3, I have thought, is there a way that we could try to provide, sometimes we have funds in which people who want to come in and, first-time home buyer assistance and apply for that we couldn't create a funding source that would allow buildings to leverage because we have a lot of residents that are on fixed incomes, and they're really between a rock and a hard place. Do they move, and will somebody be able to buy their unit when they know that there's going to be a big assessment associated with the fire and safety?
I really don't see how we can fund this in any way. I do think Commissioner Lambert's idea of maybe a cooperative purchasing approach might be something that we could look into, but I don't really see that as funding this as something that the city's responsible to do.
Not funding, but provide a leverage of sort to help them, encourage them to pursue this and get it done, as opposed to continuing to pay lawyers and lobbyists and try to sparse it up in Tallahassee, but just bite the bullet and get it done and protect, life safety for our residents and our first responders.
Let us talk about it. Commissioner James?
Thank you. As to Commissioner Lambert's point, while I certainly applaud the good intentions, I would be concerned from a liability standpoint if the city is the one that contracted with these
we wouldn't
contractors, and
contract.
because if there is a problem,
we wouldn't be the contractors. I mean, if we could get a group of people together, I mean, if we can facilitate a group of people from the different condominiums to come together and talk to some people and maybe get a better price if a number of the condominiums or the high-rises go in together, we could facilitate that discussion, but...
I can say that the three, the Jefferson, the Washington, the three that have accepted ELSs, I know they work closely together, their management teams, and there's been some discussion that they would piggyback to, assess the cost. And I think there'd probably be a lot of that going on. Just some of these buildings would be different, but those are similar buildings, and I would think that there'd be some communication on that aspect, as a logical sense.
Well, thank you, sir, for your presentation. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. Thank you.
And the very thorough background information, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Mayor, could we get a copy of his presentation?
Sure. If you would
Absolutely.
just email it to Mr. Green, and we'll get it to
Very well.
appropriate people.
Thank you.